Trump just threatened in a tweet a 20% tariff on European car imports.
Oh, boy.
Which would be huge deal.
Oh, boy.
And I find myself wondering what Charles Krauthammer would have thought of that, but unfortunately Charles Krauthammer died yesterday.
Yeah. Okay, more on that story to come. I'm shaking my head. But anyway, Charles Krauthammer, who was an amazingly courageous, classy, intelligent, persuasive, funny guy, writer, commentator, passed away. And if you knew him and loved him, you knew him and loved him. If you didn't, maybe you'll get a hint why so many people did. We're rerunning an interview from a few years back about his book, Things That Matter. That'll become apparent, I think.
Charles Krauthammer is, according to David Brooks of the New York Times, not only the most influential conservative commentator in America, his writing transcends the crush of daily events and can be read with profit always. Joe Scarborough said, without a doubt, the most powerful force in American conservatism. And he's got a new book out called Things That Matter that just debuted at number 2 on Amazon's nonfiction list. I assume behind O'Reilly's damnable killing somebody or other book.
Things That Matter, 3 decades of passions, pastimes, and politics. Charles Krauthammer joins us. Charles, it's always a pleasure. How are you?
Thank you very much. Pleasure to be with you.
Is O'Reilly keeping you out of the top spot? Is that what's going on?
Well, here I am crawling up the mountain, and there he is standing there. So I've got to figure. I pulled out a very smooth stone in my slingshot, and we'll see how this works next week.
Well, you know, when you take over number 1, he's going to crank out Killing Krauthammer in about 2 days.
That's what I hear. That's his next book.
Very good. So
it's going to be an instant bestseller, particularly in the more liberal precincts of the country.
You know, I have a feeling you're running into a lot of love on your media tour. Read the book. There's a lot of it here. I know Joe Getty, watch you every afternoon on the elliptical. Does it bother you that I am red-faced and panting while I listen to you on Brett Baer's show?
Johnny Carson once said, it's humbling to realize that 30 million people are watching you every night between their feet. So I'd rather have you panting and on an elliptical.
All right.
So I read these little blurbs where people that I respect called you among the most influential and powerful voices in conservatism. Define conservatism for me.
Well, I mean, it changes with every era. I would say that today, the essence of conservatism is a devotion to limited government, a resistance to the ever-expanding entitlement state, and a kind of what you might call constitutionalism, a kind of, using as your lodestar a return to the kind of government that was initially envisioned by the founders, realizing we're not going to have an 18th century republic, but using that as your compass to try to keep the welfare state from swallowing up all the other great institutions in society.
How optimistic are you that message can be sold in modern America and going forward, the idea of small, limited government?
Well, I'm rather optimistic because I think if you look, and I write about this in one of the columns where I'm examining the results of the elections where Republicans stormed back into power in 94, and of course where they did in 2010, that what Obama called a shellacking. If you ask people, the Gallup poll asked people to self-identify ideologically, the numbers are very, very stable. Conservative about 40%, liberal about 20%, moderate about 35%. The other 5% have no idea what planet they're living on. So, but it's 2-1. And I think in the end that if you make the case and if you make it well, generally we'll win the elections. Conservatives will win. There's always personalities that intercede. If you don't have a great candidate, that can cost you. But we lost in 2012. We had an honorable man, but a weak candidate. 2010, there's nobody at the top of the ticket. It's an off-year election. And we won very handily. That tells me the ideology, the ideas, the drive behind conservatism is still the dominant one in the country. Just needs to be expressed.
I think we would both agree with your characterization of Mitt Romney. It's disappointing to us that there hasn't emerged a great spokesman for what we're talking about, because it is such a persuasive case. I mean, the case for freedom, the case for, well, self-reliance, maybe less so to a lazy America, but free enterprise is great. How can we not find an effective spokesperson?
Well, I mean, that is sort of accidents of history. Reagan came out of nowhere. Nobody expected Reagan. Nobody expected him to be as great as he was. And sometimes you can't see that until they get onto the scene. I do think that we have a very strong bench. We're going to have a very strong series of candidates, as opposed to last time around where I thought it was particularly weak. We're going to have governors like Bobby Jindal. We're going to have Chris Christie, Scott Walker of Wisconsin, Susana Martinez of New Mexico, Jeb Bush, the former governor. I mean, he's got a problem, of course, his last name.
Mm-hmm.
So I have a suggestion. Change it.
Yeah.
Yeah, I've got one.
Okay.
Jeb Ochocinco. that way he gets two constituencies at once, Hispanics and wide receivers.
Fabulous idea, Charles Krauthammer.
But, I'm thinking about, I know, and we've talked about that Gallup poll, too. You look at it and you think, well, 2-to-1 people claim that they want, a limited government, but the percentage of people that pay taxes keeps going down. The percentage of people that get some sort of piece of the welfare state keeps growing and growing and growing. I just worry that we cross a tipping point where there are so many people dependent on the government, there's no coming back from it.
No, I think that's absolutely right. That's the great fear of conservatives, that we're sort of in a race against time to stop the expansion before you get to that tipping point. But I would point out something that I think is really important. It's happening right now before our eyes. If Obamacare collapses, and Obamacare is the great example of the entitlement state. This is the sort of the absolute extreme and most important element of the Obama and the liberal agenda. If it falls apart, as it seems to be doing, there's no guarantee, but I think it's quite probable. I think that will set back liberalism for a generation.
Wow.
What did you think of the Honorable Ms. Sebelius' testimony yesterday? I hate to say this because I come off like a softie. I almost felt sorry for her. I pulled back from the cliff because, I mean, she had no cards in her hand. And I really think it's important for Republicans to be really, really careful in questioning. The facts of what's happening in this rollout are so damning. Let the facts speak for themselves. You don't need invective. You don't need to be satirical. You don't need to do any of that. Just ask plain, simple questions. The answers are going to be so bad that they will speak for themselves.
Charles Krauthammer's new book is Things That Matter, 3 Decades of Passions, Pastimes, and Politics, including references to everything from Border Collies to Haley's Comets, from Woody Allen to Winston Churchill. Is that a single column? All those things?
That would be the zaniest column ever.
It'd be Larry King,
right? That's an excellent idea. I think I'll work on that for next week. I have a series of columns about interesting people, and also, I have these sort of weird, eccentric interests. People who followed me know baseball, chess, space, all this kind of stuff, monuments, and there's a lot of that in the book. That's the stuff that I think really matters. But on the other hand, there's a lot on politics because in the end, if you get the politics wrong in a society, you can have all the beautiful, elegant stuff in life, but it can get swept away. And that's why I devoted my life to politics. So I left medicine to do that.
Wow. I'm going to memorize that. I'm going to go back and listen to my own show and memorize that.
How did you come to your political beliefs? Or maybe the better question is, how do most people end up where they are?
I think people initially are born into their political tribe. You get it from your folks, you get it from your environment, you get it from your school. And I think around the time of your mid-teens, start to go to college, you start to form your own ideas. And for me, I was a Cold War liberal, a Democrat in my 20s. And then the change that happened to me was very simple. I'm open to empirical evidence. As you know, I was a doctor before I became a writer. And when you're a doctor and turns out the treatment that you're giving is killing your patients, you stop the treatment. And I remember when the first empirical statistical studies from the Great Society of the War on Poverty started to come in the 1980s when I was in my 30s. It was clear that not only was the War on Poverty and the Great Society a failure, but it was undermining and destroying the very communities it was trying to help. So I didn't have an overnight epiphany where I woke up in the morning and said, I think I'll be a conservative. The Lord has spoken to me. It was absorbing all this social science evidence and realizing that for all their good intentions, liberals were ruining things.
The Armstrong and Getty Show.
finish off our interview we did with Charles Krauthammer a number of years ago. Charles Krauthammer died yesterday. If you're into Charles Krauthammer, the Washington Post's coverage of this, because he worked there forever, lots of great columns and videos and stuff like that. Really good stuff if you're into Charles Krauthammer.
Mm-hmm. Yeah, so we were just talking when we left out the interview about how he came to conservatism and how, in his view, it's about empirical evidence. You know, as I've put it, and Thomas Sowell's put it, the difference between what sounds good and what actually works. But picking up with our interview, last time we talked to Charles Krauthammer on the Armstrong and Getty Show.
But is it ever possible to get the nation to the answer of we need less money and less of these programs, as opposed to the answer being, well, obviously, if this is failing, we just need to give it more money?
Well, you know, I write about this in the book where I wrote about that evolution that I had. In fact, there's an original essay at the beginning of the book that's never been published before, and it's a very long autobiographical essay on that transformation. And, you know, in thinking about it, I think you're right. You've got to make the case. But even though, I mean, I think in the end, even though people will begin to get a lot of goodies, and they may depend on that, they still have a sense of this being a free society. There's a reason why we have a Statue of Liberty in New York Harbor and not a Statue of Equality. And then you just, you believe, as I do, I think as conservatives, that in the end, the excessive paternalism and spending of the welfare state cannot succeed. As Maggie Thatcher once said, the reason socialism doesn't work is that ultimately at some point, socialists run out of other people's money to spend. The facts speak for themselves. I'm referring, for example, to Obamacare. I think it's going to be a disaster. So whatever the propaganda surrounding it, whatever the sweet rhetoric, however Obama applies his silver tongue to it, you can't fix it with words if it doesn't work in practice. So I have a kind of a bedrock belief that, since I do believe that the liberal welfare state, in the end, unless it adapts and takes radical changes, which would be conservative changes, it will fail. I think that will speak for itself, and people will respond to the facts.
Charles Krauthammer is on the line. We were talking about transitions a minute ago, and I find the story of your transition from physician and psychiatrist to journalist, writer, pundit really interesting and kind of amusing. Can you tell us a little bit about that?
Yeah, well, I was sort of ambivalent when I was in college, and this is, again, the subject of the introduction to the book. I couldn't quite decide whether to become a doctor, as most of my family is. So I applied to medical school because I sort of felt obligated to do it. But I really was interested in politics, so I went to Oxford instead to do some graduate study of political theory. And one day I woke up, well, this was an epiphany, and I thought, I'm just kind of spinning out into a world of theory and all that, and I better get real. So I went downstairs, this is in Oxford, picked up the phone, it was at the end of August, called Harvard Medical School and said, I'm on deferred admission. How about next week when the year starts? And she said to me, we just had somebody drop out of the class. If you're here by Monday, you're in. So I hopped on a plane. I took a toothbrush. I did not pack. I went there on time. I got there. The funny part is when I woke up the next day in Boston, I thought to myself, oh, my God, what have I done? Mm-hmm. But there was no going back. So I spent 7 years as a medical student and then as a resident and chief resident in psychiatry at Mass General Hospital. And I'm grateful for that time. I wasn't cut out to be a doctor, and I realized that, and I began to start to write.
At what age, how old were you when you started to write and decide that might be what you want to do for a living?
Well, I quit medicine at 28. I came to Washington to work in the Carter administration on the DSM-3, which is the Diagnostic Statistical Manual of Psychiatry, to try to guide it, to guide the research to produce that manual. So I came down as a bureaucrat in the National Institutes of Mental Health. So I'm 28 when this is happening. I'm not terribly happy in that, but I thought, if I come to Washington, one thing will lead to another. This is where they do the politics, isn't it? So I started to write. It was picked up by a magazine called The New Republic. And then one thing led to another, and Walter Mondale, the vice president, asked me to be a speechwriter for him in 1980. So that's where, people ask me, how do you go from Walter Mondale to Fox News? The answer is, I was young once.
Charles Krauthammer's book is Things That Matter, #2 on Amazon's nonfiction list.
Oh, actually, it's #2 on the New York Times list.
Okay, gotcha. Cool,
Yeah.
Awesome. Quick question before we let you go. Barack Obama. There's a lot of people trying to put the tag on him right now that he's the bystander president, that sort of thing. That he doesn't have any idea what's going on. Do you think that sticks? And do you think that's true? Is this orchestrated? That he pretends not to know, or does he actually not know what's going on in all these different things?
That's really interesting. I'm not even sure I know anymore. I used to think it was all a show. It was all a put on. It was all a way to protect himself, plausible deniability, that kind of thing. Like the Merkel thing, the Angela Merkel listening in, wiretapping her phone. I find it hard to believe he didn't know that. But, presidents always deny knowing any of this sleazy little stuff, particularly the foreign stuff. On the other, I can't quite figure it out. He's a very smart man. I've spent about 5 hours in private, off-the-record meetings with him over the in 2 occasions, once a few weeks ago and once a week before he was sworn in. He's engaging, he's smart, and he knows nuance of policy. He may not be quite at the Clinton level, but he's way up there. So it's hard for me to believe, for example, what they're saying is that he didn't know when he said, if you like your health insurance policy, you keep it. They're pretending that he wasn't really aware of the fact that there would be hundreds of thousands of cancellation letters going out. I find that hard to believe. I can't prove it, but I think he's far more engaged than it shows. But when things go south,